Hello again, Nicole Mashburn, and this is going to begin our series on cell biology. So remember, Unit 1 is going to cover Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, some basic chemistry, and some basic cell biology. So for those of you who've had high school or college biology, this is going to be a lot of review. For those of you who have not, you need to pay attention, and you may need to do some reading in your book. But again, this is going to be the what you need to know to progress through this class in regards to biology, and specifically cell biology. So when we're speaking of cell biology, we want to talk about the cell theory. And the cell theory tells us that the cell is the smallest structural and functional living unit. That means one cell is alive and can function all by itself, okay? Now, organisms, their function depends on all your cells working independently as individuals, but also collectively. So let's talk about the difference between being an individual cell and a collective cell. Now, there are single-cell organisms out there, like an amoeba or a bacteria. These are cells, single cells, that can live, they can do everything they need to do, they can divide and function and do everything they need to do. Then there are cells in our body, so for example, a muscle cell. So let's just draw a muscle cell like this. It can do everything it needs to do. It's got a nucleus, it can repair itself, it can make ATP, anything the cell needs to do, the cell can do, but one muscle cell won't get you very far. Now, if muscle cells work together collectively, if you have a bunch of muscle cells all doing their thing, functioning the way they should, and working together, then you can move. Skeletal muscles, when they contract, they will actually allow you to have movement. So cells need to work well individually and also as a collective unit in an organism, okay? I want to say one more thing about cells. As I progress, you may see me write something that starts with the word CYT. This means cell. So cytology, the study of cells. So anytime you see CYT, that's going to tell you that we're talking about something about a cell. All right, so we have many different types of cells in our body. This is just a slide giving you examples of the different types of cells. If you remember anatomy and physiology, form follows function. You'll notice all of these cells have different anatomies, different shapes, because they all have different functions. So this slide is divided into functional groups. So these are some cells that connect your body parts, form linings, transport gases. Epithelial cells, these are lining cells. Erythrocytes, red blood cells, they transport gases. Fibroblasts, they're a part of connective tissue that holds you together. You have cells that move. Skeletal muscle moves bone. Smooth muscle moves things through tubes, like your digestive system. You have cells that store nutrients, like fat cells. You have cells that fight disease, like macrophages. You have cells that help you respond to things, like nerve cells. You have cells for reproduction, like sperm and ova or egg. So all different types of cells. This is just an example. We're going to cover more and more cell types as we move through the next couple of units in this semester and in the next semester, okay? I want you to notice all of these cells have a different shape, okay, because they have a different function. But all cells, regardless of their shape, are going to have some things that are in common. They're all going to have the same parts. And so different cells are going to have different amounts of different things, different depending on what their function is. So I just want to go over a general cell, and there's many parts to a cell. And so the only ones you're responsible for right now at this point are the ones I've listed on this slide. And so what I'm going to do in the next few slides is talk about the function of each one of these things, okay? So here's my general cell, and so you have a cell membrane or a plasma membrane that holds it all in. It contains a nucleus, and then all these other things in red. These things in red, these are those organelles. Okay, basically the small organs inside of a cell. So think back to when we talked about introduction, we talked about atoms make compounds, and compounds make organelles, and organelles make cells, and cells make tissues, and tissues make organs, and organs make organisms. So the organelles are all these little parts inside of the cell. So let's go through each one of these parts and give you an idea of what they do. The first one is the plasma membrane, and this is what separates the cell. It basically gives the cell its shape. Now, we have plasma membranes. Plants have cell walls, okay? So cell membranes are plasma membranes. In us, plants have cell walls. The difference is, in us, these are flexible. The cell walls are more rigid. So think about a plant or a tree, and it's more rigid than a human. So we have plasma membranes, and these membranes, again, they're flexible. They're made up of a bimolecular layer, so two layers of phospholipids that have proteins embedded. So you have these phospholipids here and here, and then these proteins that are embedded inside that membrane. We'll do a little more about that later on as well. This is just an introduction to it. These are very important. Plasma membranes play a role in the activity of the cell. One reason is because these proteins, they have jobs to do. They can transport ions in and out of the cell. They can have receptor sites so that things can bind to them. So the plasma membrane is important not only as a boundary for the cell, but also for a place that cellular activity can occur. When I say it separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, or separates the cell, it also separates fluids. You have fluid inside the cell called intracellular fluid, and fluid outside the cell called extracellular fluid, and the membrane separates those two fluid compartments. We'll talk about that in more detail in a future video. You have the cytoplasm. There's that CYT again, cytoplasm. And this is what's located between the plasma membrane, so the boundary of the cell, and the nucleus. And it is composed of the cytosol and the cytoplasmic organelles. The cytosol is the liquid part. It has water with proteins, salts, and sugars, and other things. The cytoplasmic organelle, that's the little baby organs inside the cell that do the job. So these things in color, these are all the things that are doing their function inside the cell. You also have some things called inclusions, and just think of these as little storage areas of whatever the cell is trying to do. Maybe it needs to have something, a place to store maybe a neurotransmitter or an enzyme or something like that. So you have all these little kind of drops inside the cell that are places to store different things. And as we move along, we'll talk about some of those different inclusions in other units. You have the nucleus. Now the nucleus is important. It's the control center. This is where your DNA is, where your genetic information is, and all DNA is a blueprint for proteins, okay? So later on in a different video, we're going to talk a little bit more about DNA. We're going to talk about mitosis and meiosis and cellular division. We're going to talk about replication, protein synthesis. All that's going to be talked about later, so don't worry about that right now, but we will talk about that later. Most cells only have one nucleus, which means they're uninucleate. Some cells are multinucleate, and then some cells are anucleate. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus, and that's not completely true. When red blood cells are first formed in the bone marrow, they do have a nucleus, but when they're mature, they get rid of them because the red blood cell's job is to carry oxygen. And so we want to get rid of that nucleus so we can carry more oxygen. So red blood cells don't live very long. They're short-lived because they don't have DNA, so they can't repair themselves. They're anucleate. Cells that need to repair a lot and are kind of always growing and need a lot of protein synthesis, a lot of times you'll see them having more than one nucleus. Again, as we cover these different types of cells and tissues in our future units, we'll talk about if the cells have one or more nuclei. Mitochondria, very important, okay? This is the powerhouse of the cell. This is where ATP is made. And we make ATP through something called cellular respiration. We'll do more on this later. So we're going to have a talk about how cellular respiration occurs, how we take glucose and oxygen, and how we get out ATP. So cellular respiration is the way the cells makes ATP. It's not breathing, it's the way the cells make ATP, and we'll go into the details of that a little later on as well. Cells can have any number of mitochondria. Cells that typically use lots of energy have more ATP. So muscle cells, who are especially like heart muscle cells that are beating and contracting all the time, have a lot of mitochondria because they need a lot of ATP. Some other things that are included, these have to do with protein synthesis, ribosomes, and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. These both play a role in protein synthesis. So we talk about DNA being the blueprint for making proteins. In order for those proteins to be made, you need the ribosomes, which are these little dots here, and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And we're going to talk about their role again in a future video. And then the smooth endoplasmic reticulum plays a role in enzyme function. So again, just introducing these topics now, you'll get some more information later. And then you also have the Golgi apparatus, and this is where after a protein is made, it needs to be modified and packaged and then sent out to where it needs to go. So the Golgi apparatus is kind of like UPS. It takes the protein, fits it in the package, and then sends it out where it needs to go. And so again, we'll talk about all the steps of protein synthesis and what the Golgi apparatus does in a little bit later. But this green thing here, this is the Golgi apparatus, and the proteins have been made here on the RefER. They've been sent through the Golgi apparatus and then packaged and then sent out as needed or placed where they need to go. Again, more details to follow. You have the cytoskeleton. There's that CYT again, so cell skeleton. Remember, some cells are kind of soft and they don't have structure, and some cells are pretty rigid. They actually do have more structure than others. They have a defined shape, and so something has to give the cells that shape, and so it has a skeleton, a cytoskeleton. And so you have microtubules and microfilaments, all kind of little things. That's what these little lines are in the cell. That's supposed to represent the cytoskeleton that can give structure to the cell. Now you also have cellular extensions. These are things that kind of stick off the cell, and these are usually whip-like modal extensions. And examples of these are cilia. This is cilia, and this is the flagella. So cilia, you have many of these. So there's little hair-like projections on a cell, and we use cilia to move substances across the surface. So in your respiratory tract, so the tubes that go out to your lungs, you have these cilia that line your lungs, and so they're constantly, there's mucus that also kind of lines these tubes as well. And so when you breathe in, you want to catch all the dust and stuff, but you don't want all that going into your lungs. So it gets caught up in that mucus, and then these cilia will sweep that mucus back up to your throat. So when you clear your throat and cough, you're kind of clearing out that mucus that the cilia have washed up to the top of your throat, so you can swallow it down and get rid of it. So there's a lot of places that we find cilia, and we're going to mention those as we move through the semester. But cilia are little hair-like extensions that usually help to move things across the surface of the cell. A flagella is like a single tail. So it's used for propulsion. It will move the cell. So this is a sperm. So the flagella is the tail that helps the sperm swim. So cilia and flagella are extensions that are used for motility, to allow for movement. Not to be confused with microvilli. Microvilli, a lot of people look at that and go, that's just cilia. No, these are not hair-like projections. They're actually projections, finger-like projections of the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane has gone out and made these little plasma membrane fingers. And what that does is it increases the area for absorption, so increases surface area. So imagine this was in your small intestine, and so you've eaten some food, and as the food is basically traveling through your small intestine, if all you had was the surface area on this cell, you would have to grab it pretty quickly, and you'd have to have a long small intestine for there to be enough surface area for you to absorb the nutrients. By making these little microvilli, that increases the surface area and gives you a greater chance that the nutrients can be absorbed in a shorter amount of space in the small intestine. So we'll talk about microvilli as we move forward as well. So again, this was an introduction to the cell biology. We're going to talk about some more detail in my later videos, and then we'll come back to this in future units, in bones and muscle, nerves, and things like that. We'll go into more detail as we move through the semester. Thank you for your attention.